In the name of God, we want to talk about structuralism and beyond. It's become clear from the preceding sections, which we talked about structuralism and the movement following structuralism. Several scholars have endeavored to broaden and deepen the framework of structuralism in a number of ways, especially by introducing new concepts or proposing new points of view, like Prague School, like Copenhagen School. In this final section, we discuss the work of two of them, whose writing deserve to be acknowledged separately because of their impact and intrinsic value. Roman Jacobsen, which was belonged to the Prague School, and cassaris. Okay, dear student, in this section we will read about the ideas and viewpoints of Roman Jacobsen and cassaris. But about the Roman Jacobsen's interdisciplinary approach, we should know the ideas of each of this school. I ask you in your final exam about this, about the idea of these schools and about the followers of this school. Once Jacobsen, one of the prime leaders of the Prague Circle, we should know that Jacobsen is belong to the Prague Circle. Okay, Jacobsen, one of the prime leaders of the Prague Circle, started working in the United States in the 1941. His structuralist theory changed considerably, primarily under the influence of scientific disciplines such as information theory and cybernetic. Jacobsen redefined communication information theoretic terms as the process of transmitting information between a sender, addressor, and a receiver, addressee, thus enlarging the meaning of the term communication considerably beyond that of the verbal interaction. Okay, dear student, because Roman Jacobsen was belong to the functional school, to the Prague school, and they were functionalism. They believe in the communicational aspect of language. Therefore, he defined the information theoretic term as a process of transmitting information between the sender or addressor, because he believed in communication. They consider language in society. Therefore, he believed that the information theoretic is the process of transmitting information between the sender or addressor and receiver, addressee, and consider them as a part of the society. And he enlarged the term of information theoretic to communication and called it communication, which is beyond the verbal interaction. However, you should know that they believe in communication. They believe to apply language in society. However, throughout Jacobsen's work, the notion of structure remained omnipresent. Also, after World War II, it eventually became defined in mathematical terms. Structure became defined as a graph, a set of equivalence classes, or a transformation structure. In addition, the Saussurean distinction between long and parallel was reinterpreted as a distinction between the code and the message in communication process. Okay. Again, Jacobsen redefined the concept of long and parallel, which was used by Saussure, in this way, that consider them as a code and message in a communication process because they believe in communication aspect of language. Therefore, we should say that Jacobsen redefined the social distinction between lang and parole as the distinction between code and message in a communication process, which code is lang and message is parole. Not only did Jacobsen return to Mathesius was the founder of Prague Circle. Not only did Jacobsen return to the Mathesius concept of lang as potentiality, but he also conflated it with the psychological side of communication. Okay, he added the psychological side of communication to the concept of lang, concept of potentiality. By viewing a code as a mechanism of interpretation. During the 1980s and 1990s, Jacobsen's idiosyncratic interpretation of Saussure's CLG, Saussure book, was shown to have been seriously flawed. And his post-war linguistics was definitely still narrower interpretation of Saussure's original ideas. Still, Jacobsen played a fundamental role in diffusing Saussurean thought in the United States after World War II. Dear student, the Prague Circle series and ideas are combined of the structuralism, the European structuralism ideas, and the Russian formalism ideas. Both of that ideas are redefined again in Prague Circle. From late 1940s onward, Jacobsen became acquainted with the work of logician, mathematician, and philosopher like Peirce, whom he once called the most inventive and versatile among American thinkers. Okay, Jacobsen was familiar with the work of Peirce, which was a logician, mathematician, and philosopher. One result was that Jacobsen substituted the Saussurean relational definition of the sign with a new definition based on the view that the sign combines of signans and signetum, and the signetum being defined as a translatable part of the sign. You should know then that the effect of Peirce on the Jacobsen. Moreover, Jacobsen identifies Saussure's linguistic sign as a symbol in the Peircean sense, in which it is opposed to an index and an icon. The integration of Peircean semiotic eloquently shows how it was a matter of considerable concern to Jacobsen to make linguistic part of the comprehensive and more universally valid theory of human semiosis. In accordance with this plan, he started refuting Peirce's theory of iconicity, but also by building on Benvenist's circle interpretation of the CLG, in which it is put forward that a sign or symbol possesses a conventional meaning primarily on the basis of its use among a group of speakers. Incidentally, Saussure had also tried to integrate linguistics into the wider field of semiology and attributed semiological properties to stories, manuscripts, or texts. Jacobsen is also to be credited with having introduced one of the best-known extensions of structuralist methodology, in which systematic core linguistics is applied to natural science. Jacobsen hypothesized for the first time that a common denominator could be found for the study of phonological system of the world's language. Okay, Jacobsen stressed on the phonological part of the language. The study of the child's acquisition of phonological structure and the neurolinguistic study of aphasia, thus reducing three seemingly disparate fields of the research to a single interdisciplinary object to be studied in terms of structural premises. Okay. So sorry. Jacobsen was believed in the child acquisition of phonological structure and the neurological study of aphasia. Moreover, Jacobsen in 1956 claimed that aphasetic disturbances were mainly due to deficiencies on either the syntagmatic axis, okay, or paradigmatic axis. You know, I told you about the syntagmatic and paradigmatic axis in syntagmatic axis is similarity disorder and paradigmatic axis contiguity disorders. Also, this classification proved to be overly simple in later studies. The impact of Jacobsen's structuralist hypothesis on modern-day aphasiology can hardly be overestimated. Okay, we told you about Jacobsen and his idea, and he used some of the social terms and he changed them based on the functional aspect of language, redefined some of these aspects, and we can see that Pierce had effect on the Jacobsen's ideas about the semiology, and Jacobsen was believed in phonology, and he emphasized on the child acquisition of phonological structure and aphasia. Another approach is Augenio cassaris integrated approach. Another major figure in the 20th century linguistic, strongly influenced by the structuralism, means especially Saussure, Bloomfield, and Yilmaz, was the Romanian-born linguist Cassario. From his first publications in the 1950s, Cassario tried to overcome the restrictions of an overly rigidly defined structuralist program, and to this end he incorporated in his writing viewpoints to be found in the works of Aristotle, Humboldt, Hegel, and many other philosophers. Okay, he incorporated in his writing viewpoints to be found in the work of Aristotle, Humboldt, Hegel, and many other philosophers. One of the Cassario's better-known criticisms of the structuralist program is the Saussurian differentiate between long and parole is unsatisfactory. Cassario believed that the Saussure differentiation between the long and parole is unsatisfactory. While subscribing to the basic structuralist principle that linguistics should be founded on the analysis of paradigmatic relation, which constitute the functional language system, Cassario introduced in alignment with a number of distinctions put forward by Yilmaz, alongside long and parole, a third level called norm. Okay, Cassario add another level to the long and parole, which was norm. But you should know, for example, that maybe I ask you about the norm, and I ask you that norm term is belong to which one of the professor. You should know that norm is belong to the cassario. But what we mean by norms, you should know its definition too. Norms, cassario refers to tradition of discourse within a speech community which cannot be defined on the basis of abstract systematic opposition, but are nevertheless constitutive for speech. This is the definition and explanation about the norm. Languages around the world appear to vary greatly in their lexical as well as grammatical paradigms. Yet there is also considerable variation in the way individual languages are realized within speech communities and its sub-communities, prompting cassario to speak of an architecture of a single language. This kind of variation, however, is not random but framed by a complex array of diverging historical discourse practices, which a truly comprehensive linguistic research program should also bring to the fore. Norms then mediate between the infinite possibilities of the language system and the concrete speech realization of the individuals in historically determined a particular setting. Another step forward in broadening the structural scope is Cassario's distinction between three kinds of knowledge which speakers have about language. Okay, you should know that. This is important. That another step forward in broadening the structural scope is Cassario distinction between three kinds of knowledge which speakers have about language. Knowledge of language as a creative activity, and they are the terms which Cassario used for this knowledge. Making use of an already acquired knowledge, but also going beyond and changing this knowledge in a creative way, thus resulting in an ever-changing knowledge of the product of speech. Okay. Cassario considered three kinds of knowledge which speakers have about language. Knowledge of language as a creative activity, knowledge of language as a creative activity, making use of an already acquired knowledge, making use of an already acquired knowledge, but also going beyond and changing this knowledge in a creative way, thus resulting in an ever-changing knowledge of the product of speech. Every speech, according to Cassario, these three kinds of knowledge correspond to distinct levels of linguistic content. Every speech act relates to what the speakers know about the world and to the object they refer to when talking. Reference should not be confused with language-specific meanings, that is, the functional oppositions within the various lexical as well as grammatical paradigm of a given language from which each single linguistic item derives its best abstract value. But neither language-specific meaning nor reference are the final aim of language use. They ultimately contribute to the construction of text discourse, which are bearers of still another kind of meaning, which is sense. But what we mean by sense, which Cassario used it. The sense of a text encompasses the speaker's intention and assumption while he or she engages in discourse and is ultimately a hermeneutic object. Sense is also the level at which translation operates. A translator never translates meaning but only the sense. Okay. The sense of a text encompasses the speaker's intention and assumption while he or she engages in discourse, and is ultimately a hermeneutic object, and sense is a level at which translation operates, and a translator never translates the meaning but translates the sense. Throughout his writing, Cassaris is strongly opposed to the view, not uncommon among structuralists, that concepts such as lang and code refer to the real thing. According to the Cassaris, it is important never to forget that most concepts which linguists use to describe language are abstractions, necessary tools one works with in doing linguistic. A fully coherent and comprehensive theory of language, however, cannot be based on such abstract concepts, but only on a proper understanding of the creative linguistic activity of individual speaker. Okay, in this session, we were familiar with the Jacobsen's and Cassaris idea. Okay, I want to summarize this three or four previous sessions, and I want to explain its conclusion. As we mentioned in the introduction, the structuralism often has a negative connotation at present. As early as the 1960s, Ducrot in 1968 noted that linguistics were hesitant to qualify their work as structuralist and tended to reserve the label for the work of others. There is, however, some consensus that scholarly work in which the idea of the autonomy of language is present in one way or another can be characterized as structuralist, as opposed to primarily pragmatic, sociolinguistic, or cognitive work. This is an idea one may approve or disapprove of, but it cannot be denied that structuralism was the single most influential trend in the development of modern linguistics in the 20th century. Not surprisingly, the controversy surrounding structuralism, engaging some of its most eminent proponents as well as its critics, has predominantly been focused on its definition of the object of linguistics as an immanent and autonomous system. Most current linguistic theories, even though there are many concerned with question of context and language use, maintain several aspects of structural theory of language, at least to some extent. Moreover, by unrelentingly pursuing the question of how linguistics can coherently be conducted as a rigid social science, some of the most famous structuralists, which was Saussure, Bloomfield, Jacobsen, Cassaris, among others, created the preconditions for developing rigorous and explicit research methods in linguistics, which eventually came to exert pervasive influence on allied disciplines as well. Okay, I want to review the previous session. Okay, in this article we told you about I want to review the matter which we read them. This is this matter is belong to the session 5, your session 5, and I want to review them. About the structuralist circles and movement, as we told you that the essence of linguistic structuralism, which was followed by the publication of CLG, the Saussure books, is intimately connected to the information of a number of linguistic circles and movements in the 1920s onward. In this session, we told you about the different schools which comes from the structuralist schools, like Prague Circle, Copenhagen Circle, Geneva School, Russian Formalist, the English School, the American Structuralism, which here we told you about them briefly. About the Prague Circle, the Prague Linguistic Circle was founded in the 1926 by a group of scholars which included Roman Jacobsen, Havranek, Matesius, Makarevsky, Trubskoy, and Ternka, which Matesius was the person which we consider him as a founder of the Prague Circle. You should know about the person and follower of each school. Okay, they published in the 1929 a program which they called it as cassaris. Cassaris was particularly important in disseminating structuralist ideas in Europe. In addition, a European program for the phonological analysis of different languages was set up. Also, Pragian became particularly known for their seminal research in the phonology. Their work encompasses much more. Okay, in this paragraph we told you about the followers and founders of the Prague Circle, and we told you about their important publication, which was cassaris, and we told you about the cassaris, which was a program in this disseminating structuralist ideas in Europe, and they focused on the phonology, and to some extent the cassaris derived directly from the CLG. They get it from the CLG, which was belonged to Saussure. But some statements by the members of the circle are genuine contributions, and it is often overlooked that they indicate some fundamental differences between Saussure and the Prague Circle. Those persons who carried the Prague Circle were not the homogeneous group. They were their special ideas, and sometimes they were in contradiction with each other. Jacobsen and Trubskoy, for instance, were deeply influenced by the work of Matesius, who was incidentally a strong advocate of synchronic language studies, as early as 1911. Okay, Jacobsen and Trubskoy, like Saussure, believe in a synchronic part of linguistic. The members of Prague Circle describe themselves as both structuralists and functionalists. Why structuralist? Because they claim that every element of language is a part of a paradigmatic structure. And functionalist because they saw each linguistic unit as existing only in as far as it serves a particular purpose which ultimately contributes to the communicative function of language. A phoneme, for instance, is a linguistic unit in virtue of its function of signaling a difference in meaning. For Pragian, the specific structure of the language system as a whole is essentially due to the fact that man uses language as a means of communication. And they stress that these terms, which was means-ends model by Jacobsen, the Prague Circle radically departs from the theory of language set out in the CLG. In particular Saussure's famous schematic representation of two interlocutors should not be interpreted as relating to communication. And even we told you about this idea of the Prague School, which was very important. As we told you that the Prague Circle are functional persons. We consider them as a functional school. A well-known example of functional account along the lines of the Prague Circle is Matthesius' analysis of the utterances and sim and rim. Dear student, you should know this idea of Matthesius about sim and rim, which is very important, and you should know their definition. He contrasted with the traditional formal analysis of sentence as subject and predicate, and which in syntax we call them subject, which is equivalent to sim, and predicate, which is equivalent to rim. The sim is the basis of the statement and early known from the context, but the rim add new information to the ongoing communicative action. And as Cassaris points out, the sim and rim distinction is nothing less than a linguistic universal. Another matter in Praguean structuralism was the strict separation between the synchronic and diachronic, advocated by Saussure, should be replaced by dynamic synchronism, understood both externally as well as internally, which I explained them in the previous session. And another matter is Jacobsen teleological views on language evolution, which developed one of the most complete application of the diachronic phonology, describing the evolution of the French sound system not in terms of isolated sounds, but of their constitutive system. Another important matter, dear student, which you should know, is this matter, is this term, which you should know. It is belong to Trotsky. He also further developed the Trotsky concept of archiphony and neutralization. Dear student, these two terms is very important. These two terms are very important. Jacobsen, Trotsky used two concepts, archiphony and neutralization, which they are very important, and you should know them. You should know that these two terms, archiphony and neutralization, are belong to Trotsky. His major contribution to general linguistics is, however, the introduction of the concept of double articulation, which is still often cited as one of the major defining properties of human language. All languages can be analyzed in units, so-called monomies, with the content and the phonic expression. The latter is further analyzable as both distinctive and successive unit, the phonemes. Another school was Copenhagen Circle, which in 1931 a group of Danish linguists like Hjelmslev, Brundtland, Holt, Schens, Sørensen, and some others, which founded the Copenhagen Linguistic Circle. And they were inspired by the Prague initiative. The Copenhagen Circle never provided a linguistic community with a program that could stand the comparison with the thesis. Okay. We read about the Copenhagen Circle, which they were influenced by some person like Sechet, like Millet, Sapir, Humboldt, Boas, as well as the formalist and neo-positivist tendencies in the 1920s and 1930s, in particular the Vienna Circle. Okay. You should know the person which belong to this school and their ideas. For example, Yelmesov is one of the Copenhagen person, which is the most true to type of all structural linguistic, but in general his work is rather poorly understood, and this justify a more thorough look at it. Yelmesov's central claim is that only an appropriate, strictly scientific method can turn linguistics into a truly objective science. Okay, we told you about the idea of Copenhagen. One of the important matters is that for Yelmesov, a structure is a relational network of dependencies. In the logic mathematical sense of term, also vindicated by the logicians and philosophers of the Vienna Circle. And Yelmesov distinguished between the language internal and language external function in a much stricter sense than a Pragian. And his view, a function gives rise to linguistic entities, whereas for the Prague linguistic, every linguistic unit, phoneme, word, etc., has a function within the system. A phoneme called syneme by Yelmesov has to be defined as an intersection of different relations, whereas the Prague linguistic defined a phoneme as a sub-unit having the functional of differentiating, meaning they are different from each other to defining this term. And we told you about the important measures of Copenhagen ideas. For example, the elaborated and Saussure's definition of the sign as an entity generated between an expression and content, rejecting this view that sign point to content outside the sign itself. For this reason, Yelmesov replaced sign by the more precise sign function, which denoting a relation established between two entities, expression and content, which we told you about these terms. And Yelmesov make a difference between form, substance, and purport, and define each of them. Here you can see the Yelmesov ideas about the different part of the Saussure ideas about the significant and signify. Please read them. I told you about this session, about this matters, European structuralism, Prague Circle, Copenhagen Circle. Another one which is belong to session 6, here you can see it, about the American structuralism, which in some ideas they were shared and they were the same with the European structuralism, and in some point they are different from them. The term linguistic structuralism not only applies to the immediate European heirs of Saussure, but also the number of American linguistics since 1930. Also, the influence of the Sapir in 1921 was considerable. The main representative of this American branch of structuralism were the Bloomfield and his student Zelig Harris, whose ideas dominated American linguistics in the 1940s and 1950s. After the Sapir's death, American structuralism is also referred to the Yale School. Nowadays, it is common practice to restrict the term structuralism in American linguistics to a period before the advent of the Chomsky. Also the extent to which generative grammar continues some of the basic structuralist tenets. Okay. Here we told you about the American structuralism and their ideas, and we told you about the subpart of a language based on the structuralism. I want you to read this part, these lines, to be familiar with the ideas deeply. Okay. I told you about this session as a whole, so sorry. Okay. We told you about the structuralism and beyond, which here we define the ideas of Roman Jacobsen and Cassaris. We told you their important measures, and I want you to know them and read them. You should know that which person is belong to which school. You should know them. Please look at these videos many times and ask me your question. You are welcome to ask your question, and if you didn't get the point, I want you to look at this video many times and read its line by yourself to find out the important point and matters, and to understand the matters. And you can ask me your question, and I try to clarify it to you. Thank you. Please do it.